Okay, welcome everybody. This is History 354, and today we're talking about the ascension of Deng Xiaoping to the head of the Chinese Communist Party in 1978, and the series of reforms that he launched and also perhaps retreated from and abandoned when we get to talking about the democracy wall issue in 1978, 1979, and the early 1980s. Now, in the mid-1970s, as Mao approached his death, his wife Jiang Qing led the radical faction inside the party in a quest for class struggle and ideological unity as the means to carry on Mao's legacy even after his death. Publicly, the former actress, she stringently policed art and culture and sponsored revolutionary operas extolling the righteousness of the proletariat, while inside the party she warred with Zhou Enlai as he succumbed to cancer. She was very cruel, especially in mocking Zhou Enlai's wife, Deng Yingqiao, about the pain and misery that he was suffering as he finally gave way to cancer. 3 months after Zhou Enlai finally passed away in January 1976, throngs of Beijingers used the cover of the Qingming Festival, or Tomb Sweeping Day, a celebration for honoring ancestors, to flood Tiananmen Square with wreaths, gifts of liquor, and flowers around the monuments of the people's heroes. The crowds angrily challenged Jiang Qing and the radicals for disrespecting Zhou's legacy and their official verdict on him as a counter-revolutionary, and the government responded with a crackdown initially to silence the protests. Deng Xiaoping, meanwhile, was again purged, only to miraculously return yet again when Mao died in the fall of 1976. In the wake of Mao's death, Jiang Qing and the other members who were called the Gang of Four would be arrested and eventually convicted in a show trial in 1981. They're going to basically be scapegoated and blamed for much, if not all, of the Cultural Revolution and its disasters. But beyond the removal of these radical elements, there was a groundswell within and outside of the party of Chinese beholden to the belief that the country had to abandon the road it had taken in the Maoist years, especially the last decade. Between Zhou's death in January and Mao's in the fall, a third member of the original revolutionary generation had passed away, the militarist Zhu De. He had also died, and then a massive earthquake in nearby Tongshan would kill hundreds of thousands of people. The timing of these significant figures, their deaths, and the simmering discontent evidenced by the protests held in honor of Zhou Enlai in April, the earthquake, all these things, natural disasters, internal disorder and rebellion, they all invoked traditional Chinese ideas about these things as confirming disharmony and cosmic signals about an impending upheaval in the political landscape. For a time, it was not Deng, but the unassuming Hua Guofang, pictured up here, that rose to the summit of the CCP. Real power, though, soon concentrated around Deng. Mao and Zhou gone from the scene, Deng Xiaoping had a revolutionary pedigree that was as impressive as anyone. Going back to the 1920s, he'd been alongside Zhou Enlai in France and then worked in the underground circles to keep the movement alive in Shanghai. He'd endured the grueling Long March and guerrilla warfare against Japan and northern China, and he rose through the party and only reached the standing committee of the Politburo in 1956 when he was already in his early 50s. He was only to be ousted from the party twice in the Cultural Revolution, but truly, you can look at his political resurrections as quite remarkable, given how many other talented men and women suffered a similar fate in communist regimes in the Soviet Union and also, of course, the People's Republic of China. It was his connections to allies in the People's Liberation Army and patrons such as Zhou that ultimately proved enough to spare him the fate that would befall Liu Shaoqi, another person on his side within the CCP as a reformer and moderate in the 1960s. More than just structural and policy changes, though, Deng and the new wing of the Chinese Communist Party ascendant after Mao disassembled the underlying values and beliefs of the Maoist era. He ridiculed old slogans that talked about the superiority of poor socialist countries versus wealthier Western nations like the United States by saying poverty is not socialism. Seen from the long view, you can consider Deng's ascension and his reforms as yet another revolution in China's 20th century. Ideological and largely economic. His revolution was marked by slogans that valorized pragmatism and cooperation versus conflict and struggle, an emphasis on the proof of success in data and observation, and a gradual relaxation of party control over life and culture while still singularly holding on to power in Beijing. It was an ideological revolution wherein, for the first time in Chinese history, the profit motive, the accumulation of wealth, was encouraged as healthy, moral, and patriotic, all three in one. Now, quickly, I want to talk a little bit about how the economy was reformed. So that's something given a lot greater detail in Spence's account in your textbook. For Deng and his allies in the CCP, the way forward out of the morass had been articulated already in 1975 by Zhou Enlai before his death. Zhou then championed ideas that he had talked about in the early 1960s when China was trying to leave behind the Great Leap Forward as the basis for sweeping reforms to modernize agriculture, industry, defense, and then science and technology. That's the fourth as one big group. Sometimes that gets confusing because they're called the four modernizations, but listed that way they almost sound like five. These aims, improving productivity in these key areas, would be the top priority that drove unity and healed the country's divisions. The four modernizations would also make use, under Deng's leadership, of an open door policy, abandoning Mao's ideas about self-reliance as the true signifier of national strength, not needing anything from the international community, but producing all goods and services internally. Instead, Deng Xiaoping plotted out a gradual opening of trade and the economy to non-socialist countries, who could provide training, foreign investment, and especially access to machinery and technology of a much higher quality than China initially possessed. By 1980, Deng was able to give freer play to market forces, ending the project of collectivist agriculture. To increase productivity, he essentially made farming households into both landlords and tenants. Their work teams rented out lands to individual members and families, so they collected rent as a group. But individually, they owned those plots and were once again permitted to engage in sideline work like raising livestock, making cloth, or creating their own small machine shops and entrepreneurial enterprises. Sweeping urban reforms followed what was happening in the countryside, which spurred the development of a free labor market and private enterprise. Far fewer people by the end of the 1980s were assigned iron rice bowls and state-owned enterprises, SOEs. There formed a free labor market and greater opportunity for this private enterprise to increase specialization, profitability, higher productivity, and competition that was all seemingly based on merit, talent, and innovation. Here, China's urban areas along the coast benefited greatly from Deng's open door. Making peace with the United States paved the way for a sudden, massive influx of foreign investment. It quadruples over a decade from 1978 to 1988, China's foreign investment quadruples, with much of it coming from Japan, Hong Kong, and then later Taiwan. These little dragons, or the little East Asian tigers sometimes called, economic powerhouses orbiting near China, brought financial capital to China's cheap labor market. Deng also wisely opened China to mass tourism, a country unseen by much of the outside world for decades. Hundreds of thousands of travelers from East Asia, Europe, and North America flocked to set their sights on the Great Wall or the Longmen Grottos, a kind of Buddhist heritage site, and Luoyang. Foreigners brought with them millions of dollars of foreign currency, which could be used to purchase new technology and machinery, and Deng also especially pitched this as a way to finance the other areas of modernization. Basically, tourism paid for other sectors to grow more advanced. The reforms, though, had a number of unintended and even harmful effects on society. The move to a market agricultural system meant more commercialization, and by the mid-1980s, fewer and fewer farmers were focused on food production. The loss of these crops drove millions off farms, and the countryside and its residents toward the cities looking for work. Scarce housing and the continuance of the hukou, which were residence permits that the state demanded you seek permission to move and change occupations or where you lived and worked, meant that millions began to live in small migrant cities or shanty towns within or near the city limits of China's largest cities like Beijing and Shanghai. Without running water or electricity, Internal migrants lived on the margins of society in these places. They frequently had to return to their home villages to get access to social services or education and healthcare for their children. Ultimately, though, the rising standard of living produced by the market reforms and the wealth generated by widening trade validated Deng. China's economic miracle of the 1980s inspired reform in the Soviet Union under Gorbachev. But the secret to China's success and the Soviets' then catastrophe was in Deng and the CCP's emphasis on experimentation. Provinces like Sichuan served as laboratories to test out reforms on a small scale, rather than making wholesale changes at the national level to the economy everywhere all at once. Within these laboratories, they could study the effects of reform. The CCP had time to examine its impact, revise and tinker with policy. And when successful, the CCP could then roll it out on a wider scope to several provinces or an entire region, again testing and looking at its impact on the society and market. Only then, after much refinement and experimentation with massive amounts of data, would the CCP move to make reforms at national level. So it was very gradual and experimental. And it was based on success. The economic reforms were mirrored by smaller but still significant steps taken toward political change, a loosening of state control on political life and culture. Deng stirred the return of thousands of others who were formerly purged as officials in the 1950s and 1960s, and used his power to open up policy matters to greater debate within the party. To avoid the emergence of another Mao, to completely dominate the party, he instituted term limits and the means for an orderly succession within the CCP to avoid infighting, jockeying for power, and civil war. Term limits that were only recently repealed a few years back by Xi Jinping. Religion returned to public life after being forcibly closed by the Red Guards. Hundreds and eventually thousands of temples, mosques, and churches were reopened, and greater religious freedom was granted as long as these institutions and their clergy promised loyalty to the CCP. Underneath the relaxation of government control, a much more lively culture and society flourished that on occasion forced concessions from the government. Protests forced the CCP to reverse its negative verdict on Zhou Enlai, while a number of groups and societies from factory workers to elites began petitions and demonstrations calling for improved living conditions and human rights. Among them were women such as Fu Yuehua, who challenged the CCP on its contributions to feminism and women's rights by exposing the blatant fact of sexual abuse and forced prostitution that still existed and victimized women in society. Among the rehabilitated was the infamous feminist Deng, who had suffered abuse at the hands of the party multiple times in her long career on the political left. Deng had grown up in Hunan province, the daughter of a remarkable woman who had entered school in her 30s after losing her husband. Her mother's aspirations to be educated and willingness to brook convention made a deep impression on the future author. At age 16, she fled her family and Hunan to avoid her uncle arranging her marriage and set off for an emancipated life amidst the May 4th movement, traveling wildly, living in cities like Nanjing, Shanghai, and Beijing. Studying and finding her voice as a writer, she first fell in love with the Anarchist Party, admiring stories about the liberation offered women in the Soviet Union. She also fell for the young poet Hu Yepin. By her early 20s, her stories were at the avant-garde of the new culture's literary movement. Short stories playing with notions about women's frustrations with the search for independence and modern love and lust. But she and her husband were also watched nervously by the Kuomintang that hunted after joining the CCP. Her husband was arrested and executed in 1933. She was placed in prison, then later house arrest from 1933 to 1936. Okay, I'm going to pause here and I'll pick up with the rest of Deng's story and the rest of this lecture in the next video.